Welcome to Slash Forward. In this episode, we're gonna our way to alpha status with the 1996 werewolf film Bad Moon. Let's get to it. We open on a tropical landscape. As we plunge below the canopy, we find an encampment of photographers and documentarians, plotting their course toward a nearby airstrip to deliver their most recent cache of film. Under the light of the moon, the horses get spooked by an unseen presence, and the trail guides disperse. Ted and Marjorie, randy as hell from an evening of orienteering, are too busy to notice. This results in them being outbeasted when Marge is shaken around like a rag doll, before Ted manages to level off the creature's shoulders with a shotgun, driving home the analogy that sex is pain. We transition to a small mountain town where we meet Thor taking his owner Brett for a run. They're approached by a traveling con man referred to as a flopsy and offered the privilege of buying some books. While doing so, he antagonizes Thor, eliciting an attack so he can try to squeeze them for money. This is when Janet demonstrates her take-no-guff demeanor, explaining she's a smart and sassy attorney and flexes on this fool with her connections and influence.
We ain't heard the last of this lady.
You're a lady? Out in the misty woods that night, we find a logger doing his nightly work, measuring girth. He's startled by a nearby roar and takes off like a jackrabbit. He stops to rest after redlining for about 20 seconds and finds it wasn't enough. The next morning, Janet gets a call from her brother Ted, back in town and ready to receive them at his lake house. Or trailer, his lake trailer. They do some catching up and he confides that things have been rough for him since returning from the jungle and losing Marjorie. Inside, Ted secures his cool uncle status when Brett finds he's into chemistry and werewolf folklore. Meanwhile, in the woods, Thor finds the remnants of the logger, who died as he lived, in a tree. Janet has to force a commitment out of Ted to call that week, but he does so earlier than expected due to unforeseen circumstances. He parks his Airstream in her yard and Thor quickly roots through his things searching for contraband and uncovering evidence of Ted's inclinations. That night, Thor goes crazy at the back door, so Janet lets him out. He tracks through the woods, eventually bearing witness to a strange sight, a beast cuffed to a tree. He takes a moment to gloat that he's not tied up, before being called back. The next morning, Brett has trouble getting Thor to play. He's more interested in asserting his dominance than playing kid games. Ted comes out and engages in an animalistic stare down. But if he's not whipping it out, Thor is not impressed. Inside, over breakfast and news of a handful of eviscerated hikers, Ted talks to Janet about the dangers of large woodland predators. He recommends she keep Brett and Thor away from the woods, especially his nightly running path. That night, Thor blocks Ted from his run, risking his heart health and creating a very dire situation. So Ted, limited on time, eventually emerges and asks for an assist from Janet. Very shortly after this, Brett shows up and lets Thor back out. He quickly locates Uncle Ted's fresh starter gear, and we learn Thor delayed him too long as the restraints are unencumbered by werewolf arms. As a good boy, he knows what this means and circles back to the house, where he fends Ted off after a brief scuffle. Janet finds Thor with minor injuries and goes to check on Ted, but his trailer is empty. She happens upon some of his personal items, finding some disturbing materials, along with diary entries detailing his affliction and top 3 crushes of all time. As she returns to the house, we see old Flopsy lurking in the shadows, getting ready to teach someone a lesson, and is promptly mauled in the side yard. The next morning, the sheriff shows up to notify Janet of the salesman's remains found down the road. Knowing they had a prior altercation, he seems to suspect Thor, but also suggests it likely the work of a much larger predator, so as a courtesy, he lets her off with a warning. Janet goes to confront Ted about his evening activities, but the territorial disrespect is too great, and Thor ends up chewing on his forearm a bit, and Ted kinda likes that. Thor goes into timeout until animal control arrives to take him away. Now, Ted gets to gloat and express his dominance as he takes a tinkle on Thor's front porch. That evening, they have an uncomfortable family dinner, during which Ted seems to be losing hold of his humanity, and stubbornly refuses medical treatment for his arm. Janet asks him a parting question about Marjorie's whereabouts,
Seattle,
which she knows to be a lie based on the contents of his diary. That night, Brett sneaks out with a plan to rescue Thor, but has trouble establishing how locks work. So he says screw it and hops the fence. Floodlights be damned. At the same time, Janet is walking through the woods looking for Ted. She finds him sweating and acting weird, very similar to that time he left his door unlocked in high school. He gets mad at her like it's her fault he's a wolf, and then begins to transform, missing the opportunity to restrain himself. Thor manages to escape on his own and leaves Brett behind in his cage, running off in pursuit of Ted and Janet, who has thankfully managed to retreat into the safety of her mostly glass house. Ted somehow finds a way in and pursues Janet upstairs, but she's able to delay him long enough for Thor to arrive, and a caning fight ensues, in which each of them manage to both take and inflict some damage. When Ted grabs Brett, Janet levels her revolver and unloads 8 shots into his center mass before Thor tackles him out of the window. Thor then pursues Ted, tracking him into the morning hours when Ted emerges all squishy and pink, sans claws and sharp teeth. So Thor reasserts himself as the apex predator. We then see that everyone survived, and Thor gets petted forever. And that was Bad Moon, an interesting take on a classic story. If you enjoyed the video, I'd love for you to become a part of the channel by subscribing. Thanks for watching.